So we are done with cell organelles for now. And we're moving on. We're still in the same unit. We're still talking about cellular systems. But now we're going to start to talk about a few different topics about different processes that take place within cells. So we're going to start today talking about the transport of material in and out of the cell. Then we'll talk a little bit about photosynthesis and respiration, actually a lot, in quite a bit of detail. And we'll talk a little bit about cell reproduction as well. We'll finish out this unit. So this notepad will bring us throughout the end of the unit. We'll basically don't have a lot of notes on cell transport just today. And then we have a couple labs we'll do next week, a couple of reading activities and questions, and then we'll be moving on. So we covered this pretty extensively in 7th grade, so we don't have a ton of notes about it. We'll just sort of try to remember what we talked about in 7th grade, and we have some new terms that we're going to have to use this year. So this is cellular transport, movement of molecules into and out of cell. And as we talked about, there are a couple ways that molecules can move into and out of cells. One is through this process called passive transport. Passive transport is diffusion. Movement of molecules without expending any energy. A cell does not have to expend energy for molecules to diffuse in or out of the cell. Hopefully, as you remember from 7th grade, molecules will diffuse from high to low concentration. We call that moving down the concentration gradient from high to low concentration. So this can happen in a couple of different ways. So for some molecules, they can just pass right through the cell membrane, almost as if it's not there. Lipid-soluble molecules, okay? Hydrophobic molecules can basically pass right through the cell membrane. And that's what this first part of the drawing shows. These molecules are in a high concentration on the outside of the cell, a lower concentration inside the cell, so they're basically just diffusing right through the cell membrane. But other molecules can't just diffuse through the membrane. They need a little bit of help. And they get that help through some of those proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. Remember, these proteins have lots of functions, but one of the functions is to help with transport. So this is a channel protein. Okay? These are examples of what we call facilitated diffusion. Okay? They need some help, a facilitator, somebody to help something happen. Okay? And those proteins are the facilitators of this. So again, they still don't require energy, but they do need special proteins in the cell membrane in order for the molecules to pass through. Okay? This is a channel protein. Basically, it almost acts as like a tunnel through the cell membrane for a certain specific molecule. And so these triangle-shaped molecules, they're diffusing into the cell, but they need this channel protein in order to pass through them. That's one type. Another is a carrier protein. Carrier proteins are proteins that actually change their shape to allow molecules to get through. So this carrier protein opens up, allows one of these blue circle molecules in, and then it changes shape, and then the molecule is on the inside of the cell membrane. Again, though, it's just through this process of diffusion. These don't require energy. Osmosis, does everyone remember what osmosis is or how that's different from diffusion? Back from 7th grade, we did like a whole bunch of different demonstrations of osmosis in 7th grade. We did the gummy bears and the eggs and the carrots and the dialysis tubing and all those different things. And Mom, what's osmosis? Yeah, it's a type of diffusion. So it's still diffusion, but when it's water diffusing and it's going through a membrane, we call it osmosis. So we're going to have to define some new terms here that we use. But let's just, if you remember, what happens to a cell that is placed in pure water, typically? A cell placed in pure water, right? What's that? It swells up. Water moves into it, it swells up, can burst even. What happens to cells that are placed in, let's say, very salty water? Okay. They shrivel up. They lose water. They get smaller. They shrivel up. And that's due to osmosis. So we have some terms that we use to describe, when we're comparing the concentrations of two solutions, we have these terms we use: hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic. So these have to do with how much of the solute is there. Is there a lot of solute and less solvent, or vice versa? So hypotonic, do you know what the prefix hypo means? You ever heard hypoglycemic, hypodermic needle, hypochondriac? That?
Like not enough, like less.
Yeah, it means like less or under. Hypotonic solution has less solute and more water. So what is the ultimate hypotonic solution? No, even more than saline.
Pure water.
Just pure water, right? Pure water has no solute. It's just all water. Hypertonic. Hyper means more, extra, above. Hypertonic solutions have more solute and less water. You know, in our 7th grade experiments, when we used corn syrup, that was a hypertonic liquid. When we used molasses, when we used really salty water, those were all examples of hypertonic solutions. There's more solute, less water. And then we have some situations when we have two solutions that are isotonic. That means they basically have the same level of water and solute mixture. So if we think about those names, when cells are placed in a hypotonic solution, they lose water and they shrink, they shrivel up. When cells are in a hypertonic solution, I'm sorry, did I say that? I mixed that up. So cells placed in a hypotonic solution gain water. Hypotonic has high concentration of water. Cells placed in a hypotonic solution gain water and swell up. When cells are placed in a hypertonic solution, they lose water, they shrivel, they shrink. That's called plasmolysis. And if a cell's in an isotonic solution, there's no net movement of water. They stay the same. So this becomes really important for single-celled organisms that live in fresh water. They have, this is a paramecium. So compared to the paramecium, the pond that it lives in, is the pond hypotonic or hypertonic? The pond. Right? Hypotonic, correct. It's mostly just water, very little dissolved substances. So these organisms, single-celled organisms living in this hypotonic solution, have a tendency for water to enter them because of osmosis. And if they didn't have a way of dealing with it, this water coming in would cause them to swell up, would cause their cell membrane to burst. But that doesn't happen. They have special organelles often to get rid of this excess water. In protists, we call it the contractile vacuole. It basically fills up with water, squeezes, pumping out excess water so that the cell doesn't swell up. So just a diagram to show what happens when these cells are placed in various solutions. In a hypotonic solution, water enters the cell. In an animal cell, it can lead to them bursting. In a plant cell, it usually doesn't lead to them bursting. It leads to sort of the insides taking in water and pushing against the cell wall, giving it its shape. This is why if you have a plant that's sort of wilting when it doesn't have enough water, you water it, okay, it takes in that water, sort of swells up, pushes against the cell wall, giving it sort of strength. In an isotonic solution, water comes in, water goes out, but at relatively equal amounts. And same thing in the plant cell. In a hypertonic solution, this is when cells lose water, they shrivel up, they get smaller. The plant cell, the cell wall doesn't really change much because it's just sort of a hard outer shell. But all of the insides sort of contract and shrink and shrivel up. The cell membrane pulls away from the cell wall, okay, and the cell shrivels up. The organelles all get constricted. So all of that are means of passive transport. Osmosis, diffusion, channel proteins, those carrier proteins we saw earlier, those were passive transport. But there are many times in cells when active transport is necessary. So in active transport, ATP is needed, energy is needed. In active transport, molecules are moving against the concentration gradient, from low to high concentration, rather than high to low. Active transport also requires special proteins. It requires ATP. So let's look at this example. This is the sodium-potassium pump. This is a really important protein found in cell membranes. Really important in nerve cells, neurons. Use this to generate nerve impulses, an electrical signal that travels down the neuron. And so the sodium-potassium pump works. It pumps sodium ions out of the cell against the concentration gradient. Okay? So there's a low concentration of sodium in the cell. It gets pumped to the outside of the cell. The way it works is there's a protein there. That's what we call the sodium-potassium pump. It's a special type of protein. 3 sodium ions sort of fit in to this protein. Once they bind to it, ATP is needed, and that changes the shape of the protein. And it opens up, releasing these sodium ions to the outside of the cell. So they went from a low concentration to a higher concentration against the concentration gradient, but it used energy to do that. Then the protein's open to the outside. The reverse process takes in 2 potassium ions. They bind to the protein, okay. The phosphate, that triggers the phosphate to be released, which brings the protein back to its original shape, and now the potassium is inside the cell. So it moved both of these ions against the concentration gradient, and now it can work again to pump out 3 more sodium and allow 2 more potassium in. Again, this is really important in nerve cell function. Another important example of active transport is called the proton pump. Proton pump is a very common protein found in cell membranes, okay, and has an important job to do. It does exactly what it says. It pumps protons from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. Proton is a hydrogen ion, positively charged atom. And so they get pumped out through this special protein from a low concentration inside to a high concentration outside. But it requires ATP in order to happen. So it pumps these hydrogen ions out, and it creates an electrical charge, because you have a lot of positive charge outside of the cell, negative charge inside the cell. And that voltage, that electrochemical gradient between the cells, is important in how cells work. Another example of the proton pump and how it affects us. person, like I used to get heartburn really bad, like every single day. And so heartburn is caused when stomach acid creeps up your esophagus and hurts and can damage it over the long term. And so the treatment for that, there's lots of things you could do. You could take antacids to neutralize your stomach acid. But another medication you can take is called a PPI, a proton pump inhibitor. That's what it stands for. And this proton pump inhibitor, what it does is it interferes with proton pumps in your digestive system. Because these proton pumps, hydrogen lowers the pH. That's where some of our stomach acid comes from. And so by inhibiting this pumping of hydrogen ions to the outside, we decrease the pH of our stomach fluids, and therefore it's less likely to cause heartburn. Okay, so those medicines are important. There's other ways of reducing stomach acids, but that's one of the common ones, this proton pump inhibitor. Again, it's just working, this molecule in the medicine binds with and interferes with this proton pump in the digestive tract. Takes away the heartburn. All right. Any questions about passive or active transport? All right, that's all our notes for this section.